Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
This time we're going to be looking at something that really kind of struck me as interesting when I was reading through Malcolm Gladwell's David and Goliath.
hmm
We're going to be talking about the power of underdogs,
Yeah.
but also we're going to be comparing that with some stuff that was happening in Northern Ireland during the Troubles.
Right.
So our two main sources for today are going to be excerpts from David and Goliath.
Okay.
We're going to be focusing mostly on the Birmingham campaign from that book.
All right.
And then we're also going to be using Rosemary Lawler's story,
Yeah.
her firsthand account of the Troubles in Belfast.
Fascinating how both of those stories, even though they're separated by time and geography, they really kind of make you think about power in a different way.
Yeah.
We tend to think that the side with more resources, more might automatically wins, but these stories kind of show us that that's not always the case.
Yeah, one of the things that Gladwell talks about is this idea of the trickster hero.
Mhm.
And he uses the story of Brer Rabbit, who, is able to kind of use his cunning and his wit
Right.
to outsmart all these bigger, stronger animals.
Yeah.
And he compares that to what was happening during the Birmingham campaign
Okay.
with Wyatt Walker,
Mhm.
who was one of the main strategists along with Martin Luther King Jr.
Mhm.
during that time.
Right.
So I guess my question is how did Walker kind of use that trickster energy?
Well, one of the main things is that Walker, he understood Bull Connor,
Yeah.
who was, the commissioner of public safety in Birmingham.
Yeah.
And he knew that Connor was deeply racist and prone to violence.
Yeah, and really just a terrible person.
Yeah, he was, awful.
Yeah.
But Walker recognized that Connor's prejudice was actually a weakness.
Okay.
It was something that could be exploited.
So instead of being afraid of that racism, he actually kind of going to use that as almost like a weapon.
Yeah, in a way.
Okay.
Because what he did was he intentionally kind of inflated the number of protesters that were going to be out there.
So he's making it seem like it's going to be a much bigger threat.
Exactly. He's trying to provoke reaction,
Oh, wow.
okay, from Connor.
And that's a really risky thing to do. I mean, you're talking about a guy who's already shown that he's willing to use violence.
It was risky, absolutely.
Yeah.
But Walker calculated that Connor's overreaction would ultimately help the movement.
So how did that actually work out?
Well, Connor,
Yeah.
he did overreact. He responded with, excessive force.
Yeah.
Police brutality against these peaceful protesters,
Right.
especially the children,
Right.
which was all broadcast on national television.
And that's one of the things that I think really is important to remember is the context of the time.
Mm-hmm.
The entire nation is watching this.
Right.
And so when they see these images of police brutality against peaceful protesters, it's shocking.
Yeah. It really shocked the nation's conscience.
Yeah, and it really, I think, turned the tide.
Yeah, it did.
And so Walker knew that that was going to happen. He knew that by provoking this reaction from Connor, that it was going to actually end up helping the movement.
Exactly. He understood the power of the media
Right.
and how visual imagery could really sway public opinion.
Right. And even something like that photo of Walter Gadsden
Yes.
standing there facing the police dog. I mean, most people, when they see that photo, they think about passive resistance.
Right. They see it as, surrender.
Yeah.
But Gladwell points out that Gadsden was actually fighting back.
Really?
Yeah, he was using his knowledge of dogs
Oh, wow.
to actually protect himself in that moment.
That's incredible. And it really changes the whole context of that photo.
It changes the narrative.
Yeah.
It's not just passive protest. It's a moment of calculated defiance.
Yeah.
And that's where this whole trickster archetype comes in.
Yeah.
Like Brer Rabbit Walker wasn't playing by the rules set by the Goliath, in this case, Bull Connor.
Right.
He was creating his own rules
Okay.
and using Connor's weaknesses against him.
So he's turning the tables.
Ex-
And that's really interesting because we think about power. We always think about it in terms of like resources or military might.
Mm,
But this shows us that power is also about understanding the dynamics of a situation
right.
and kind of using them to your advantage.
Absolutely. And sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a physical one.
Right.
It's the ability to manipulate perception.
To control the narrative.
Exactly.
And I think that's something that we see in both Birmingham and in Belfast.
Yeah.
This idea that those in power underestimated the strength and resolve of those that they were trying to control.
Right.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Northern Ireland
Okay.
and what was happening during the Troubles.
Right.
And let's use Rosemary Lawler's story as kind of our guide through that.
So Rosemary's story is a really good illustration of the fact that raw power isn't enough.
Yeah.
Her account of the British Army's intervention,
Mm.
especially the Lower Falls curfew,
Yeah.
really highlights this idea called the principle of legitimacy.
The principle of legitimacy.
Yeah, and I think we can all relate to this. Have you ever found yourself, you know, obeying an authority figure,
Yeah.
not out of fear, but because you felt like their authority was justified?
Like if a teacher asks you to do something and you respect that teacher,
Exactly.
you're more likely to do it
Right.
than if it's a teacher that you don't respect.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Nathan Leitz and Charles Wolfe Jr. were talking about in their book, Rebellion and Authority. They argue that, obedience to authority is often a rational calculation.
So we're kind of weighing the costs and benefits.
Exactly. When the authority is seen as legitimate,
Right.
the benefits of obeying outweigh the costs.
But if you don't see that authority as legitimate, then you're more likely to rebel even if there are going to be big consequences.
Precisely. And think about the British Army in Northern Ireland.
Okay.
They went in with all this power,
Yeah.
Superior resources intending to restore order. Right.
But their actions a lot of times lacked legitimacy in the eyes of the Catholic community.
And Rosemary Lawler talks about that. She talks about this constant fear.
Yeah.
And this escalating violence, and then all of a sudden the army is there with their armored cars, and they're imposing these curfews. She describes it as feeling like a war zone.
And that's really where this principle of legitimacy comes into play.
Okay.
Because the British Army's actions, they were supposed to calm things down.
Yeah.
But they often inflamed the situation.
So even though they had, the Goliath advantage of military might, they weren't really winning the hearts and minds of the people that they were supposed to be protecting.
Exactly. Their tactics like the Lower Falls curfew and their tolerance of these provocative Protestant marches, they fueled resentment.
Okay.
And it actually strengthened the IRA.
So it's almost like by going in and trying to impose their will with force.
They actually made things worse.
They did. They were applying force without understanding the underlying dynamics of the conflict.
The history.
Yeah, the deep-seated mistrust between the communities.
So is the takeaway here that brute force is never enough?
Well, it's more nuanced than that.
Okay.
I think what we're seeing here is that power is multifaceted.
Okay.
It's not just about having more guns or soldiers.
Right.
It's about understanding the social, the cultural, the historical context in which that power is being used.
It's about winning hearts and minds.
Exactly.
And it's not just about winning battles.
Right.
And in both Birmingham and Belfast, we see how those in power, they underestimated that.
They did.
And they ended up paying the price.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really fascinating to me how you can have all of the power in the world, but if you don't have legitimacy, it almost means nothing.
Yeah, and Rosemary Lawler's story is a great example of that. She talks about the curfew, soldiers kicking indoors. And the moment where the priest was tear gassed?
Yeah, that was a huge turning point.
It just shattered any idea that the army was impartial.
Yeah, they were supposed to be peacekeepers.
Right.
Not taking sides.
Right, and it showed that they really weren't.
And the breaking of the Lower Falls curfew is a perfect example of that.
It is.
You have thousands of women, many of them pushing prams, marching down to bring food to the families that were trapped by the curfew.
Right.
And the army was completely caught off guard.
They had no idea what to do.
It's almost like they didn't expect a bunch of women with prams.
Right. They completely underestimated the power of that kind of action.
Yeah.
It's easy to dismiss something like that.
Right.
But what they failed to grasp was the symbolic power.
Yeah.
These women weren't just bringing food.
Right.
They were challenging the army's authority.
They were saying, we don't recognize you as having the right to do this.
Exactly. And it worked.
Yeah.
Those images of those women, facing down the soldiers, singing We Shall Overcome, broadcast around the world.
Yeah. It was a PR nightmare.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. A huge embarrassment for the British government.
Right.
Because it exposed the limitations of their approach.
Right.
They might have had the guns and the manpower.
Right.
But they didn't have the moral authority.
Right. And that's really what legitimacy is all about.
Yeah.
So what could they have done differently?
Well, there were other models.
Okay.
If you look at Joanne Jaffe's approach to policing in Brownsville, New York.
Okay.
She understood that, true power doesn't come from force.
Okay.
It comes from building trust.
Okay.
Instead of treating the community like an enemy.
Yeah.
She focused on building relationships.
So it's a completely different mindset.
It is. It's revolutionary. I mean, she would hold Thanksgiving dinners for families in the projects.
Wow.
She'd give out Christmas presents.
That's incredible.
She wanted the community to see the police as a resource.
Not as an occupying force.
Exactly. And it worked.
Yeah.
Crime rates plummeted.
Wow. So just by changing that perception,
right,
she was able to make real change.
Right. And it's a much more sustainable approach in the long run.
Yeah. It seems like both Wyatt Walker and Joanne Jaffe, they understood something really important about power.
What's that?
It's not just about dominating others.
Right.
It's about inspiring them, earning their trust and their respect.
And that's something that goes beyond time and place.
It applies to everything.
It does.
Our relationships, our workplaces.
Yeah, think about the leaders that you admire.
Yeah.
What makes them effective?
Yeah. It's not just because they're in charge.
Right. It's because they connect with people.
Yeah.
They inspire them.
They make them feel heard.
Exactly.
Well, what about the ethical considerations here? Walker manipulated Connor's prejudices. And Jaffe, she was criticized for being too lenient on criminals.
Right. Is it always okay to bend the rules?
Right.
Even for a good cause?
Yeah, that's a tough question.
That's a really complex question with no easy answers.
Yeah.
But, their methods were controversial.
Right.
But they achieved results.
Yeah.
So it raises questions about the relationship between ethics and effectiveness.
Right. Like, when is it okay to do something that might be considered wrong?
Right.
If you think it's going to lead to a good outcome.
Exactly.
And sometimes it requires looking beyond the surface and understanding the bigger picture.
Right.
Walker and Jaffe both understood that real change doesn't happen overnight.
No, it takes time.
Right.
It takes patience.
And it takes understanding where the other person is coming from.
It's about challenging our assumptions, questioning the easy answers.
And recognizing that true power lies in understanding the relationships that shape our world.
Absolutely.
It's interesting to me how both of these stories really show us that there's not always a clear good guy and bad guy.
Right.
It's not black and white. It's really complex.
Absolutely.
There are a lot of gray areas. And one of the things that I was thinking about was Wyatt Walker's decision to use children in the protests.
Yeah, that was controversial.
It was.
Even within the movement.
Right. I mean, you could definitely see how some people would say that that was manipulative.
Yeah.
That he was putting kids at risk for a political agenda.
Right.
But on the other hand, those images are so powerful.
They are.
They really did change public opinion.
They did. They helped turn the tide against segregation.
So it's that question of, do the ends justify the means?
Right. Is it ever okay to use those kinds of tactics?
Yeah, and Gladwell brings up Malcolm X.
He does.
And Malcolm X's critique of this tactic.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting because Malcolm X was obviously much more radical than Martin Luther King.
Right. He called it cowardly.
Yeah.
He said, real men don't put their children on the firing line.
And it really makes you think, even when you're fighting for a cause that you believe is right, sometimes the lines get blurry.
They do.
And it's hard to know what the right thing to do is.
And it gets even more blurry in a conflict like Northern Ireland, where there's so much history, so much pain and resentment on both sides.
And Rosemary Lawler talks about this.
She does.
She talks about her brother, Ian, who was shot and killed.
Yeah, by a British soldier.
And she says she doesn't know if he was involved with the IRA or not.
Yeah.
And she says it didn't really matter.
Right, because to the army.
They were all suspects.
Exactly.
It goes back to that idea of legitimacy.
Yeah.
When you don't have trust.
Right.
When there's no communication. It creates this environment of fear and suspicion.
And it makes it really hard to tell who's on what side.
Right. And any act, even one that's meant to keep people safe, can be seen as an act of aggression.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of what happened in Northern Ireland.
It is.
The British Army's trying to control things.
Right.
But they actually end up making the situation worse.
Right. It's like they're trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Yeah.
They might have good intentions.
Right. They might have the best equipment.
Yeah. But if they don't understand the root of the problem, their actions are just going to escalate things.
So legitimacy is really important.
It is. It's not just about having power.
Yeah.
It's about having the right to use that power.
And for people to see that as a legitimate use of power.
Exactly. It's about earning people's trust and cooperation.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here, What are some of the big takeaways?
Oh, I think the first thing is that these stories show us that the world is complex.
Yeah.
It's not always a simple case of good versus evil.
And we have to be careful
about
thinking that we have all the answers.
Right, because the good guys don't always win.
And brute force isn't always the answer.
It rarely is.
And just because somebody's in a position of authority doesn't mean they're always going to do the right thing.
So we need to be aware of the complexities, the unintended consequences.
And understand that power is always changing.
Right.
It's not static.
It's fluid.
Yeah.
It's constantly being negotiated.
And the stories of Wyatt Walker and Rosemary Lawler, I think, give us some really valuable lessons.
They do.
About how to navigate all of this.
Absolutely.
They teach us how important it is to understand the other side.
Yeah.
To really think about what their motivations might be.
To see the world from their perspective.
And to use our own strengths, whatever those might be, to our advantage.
And to build relationships. To foster trust.
Yeah.
To earn legitimacy.
And they show us that even when things seem impossible, we can make a difference.
We can.
We can challenge the way things are.
Absolutely.
And we can create real change.
But we need to be aware that the path to change is rarely easy.
And that the choices we make
Yeah.
have consequences.
They do. Sometimes those choices are going to be really hard, and they might even be controversial.
But it's by facing those tough choices
and
really thinking about them that we can learn to use power more responsibly.
And effectively.
So as you go about your day,
Yeah.
think about the dynamics of power that you see.
In your own life.
In your own life, your relationships at work, in your community.
Okay.
Where do you see legitimacy being challenged?
Where do you see underdogs fighting for their rights?
And how can you use your own influence to create a more just and equitable world?
Because that's really what these stories are about. They're not just about history.
They're about us.
Yeah, they're about our capacity for good and bad.
And our desire for a better future.
And they remind us that sometimes the most powerful force for change isn't a government or an army.
It's ordinary people.
It is.
Who are willing to stand up for what they believe in.
People like Wyatt Walker.
People like Rosemary Lawler.
Exactly.
Who are willing to challenge the Goliaths.
In their own lives.
In their own lives. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.
We hope you learned something.
We hope it gave you some things to think about.
And that it inspires you to look at the world in a new way.
And to use your own power for good.